Welcome to Inside East African Politics. Today, we're taking a deep dive into Kenya, a nation often seen, as a key player in East Africa, but whose democracy seems to be under some significant strain right now. We're looking at a really complex situation, reports of violent crackdowns, serious claims about government critics being targeted, and, while what looks like a shrinking space for any kind of dissent, President William Ruto's administration, you'll remember, came in back in August 2022. It was after a really intense election, and the initial promises were about upholding human rights, democratic freedoms. But what we've seen unfolding since then, particularly over the last year or so, suggests, well, a concerning shift, maybe a hardening stance towards opposition.
Indeed. And we're not just talking about general feelings here. There's documentation from Kenyan observers and international groups detailing repeated instances of police brutality and protest, particularly those big ones in mid-2024 against the finance bill, being met with reportedly live fire. What's really striking, I think, is that even after President Ruto actually withdrew that bill, a major concession, you might say the authorities seem to have continued pursuing dissenters, maybe even with more force, and using these quite alarming new tactics.
And human rights groups are now, well, they're sounding a serious alarm, aren't they? Warning that Kenya's rights record has, quote, deteriorated, that this could really tarnish its democratic reputation internationally. So that's our mission today, to unpack these developments, try to understand the key events, and think about the implications, for Kenya's future and its role. All right, so let's start with maybe one of the most disturbing aspects that emerged as things heated up. This dramatic rise in what are being called enforced disappearances and abductions. What's going on there?
Yeah, it paints a very grim picture. The report suggests that since around June 2024, over 80 Kenyans, many of them young activists, people critical of the government, have vanished. These disappearances reportedly happened after encounters with individuals described as, plainclothes police or maybe intelligence officers.
Over 80 people.
That's the figure documented by the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, the KNCHR. They tracked 82 cases through late 2024. And as of then, nearly a third, 29 people, were still reported as missing. So this isn't just about arrests where people know where someone is. It's people literally disappearing.
And the accounts from witnesses and even some who were later released, they sound terrifying. Masked officers, unmarked cars.
Absolutely harrowing stories. We heard about, for instance, two brothers pulled from their car in Nairobi, blindfolded, held in some dark room for, I think it was over 30 days, beaten, barely fed, and constantly interrogated about who the protest organizers were.
Wow.
And Human Rights Watch, HRW, they've corroborated a lot of this. They confirmed security officers holding people in places like forests, abandoned buildings, often with no charges filed at all.
And you mentioned torture.
Yes. Deeply disturbing reports. People being beaten with rifle butts, kicked for hours, death threats. It's brutal stuff. And what makes this particularly concerning, pointing towards something systemic, is that HRW's interviews suggest the abductors weren't just random thugs. They were allegedly from elite security units.
Elite units? Like who?
We're talking about the Directorate of Criminal Investigations, the DCI, the Anti-Terrorism Unit, the Rapid Deployment Unit, even reportedly military intelligence.
So these are major state security branches.
Exactly. Units normally focused on serious crime or national security threats. Their alleged involvement here suggests a significant and pretty alarming use of state power against dissent.
And the profile of the victims seems very specific.
Almost all were outspoken critics of a government, or people known to have participated in the anti-Ruto protests. Al Jazeera, for example, highlighted cases including student leaders, protesters, and even Gideon Kibet, a political cartoonist known for his critical work on President Ruto.
I remember that case. He vanished after an opposition rally.
In December 2024, yes. He was eventually found safe in January 2025, but his disappearance raised huge questions.
And the official response?
Well, after months of denials, President Ruto did publicly acknowledge the abductions in January 2025. He promised investigations, insisted the police were acting appropriately.
But critics weren't convinced.
Not really. They point out that police and intelligence chiefs have reportedly ignored court orders demanding they appear for abduction inquiries. That really undermines confidence. And according to Amnesty Kenya's Houghton Irungu, this whole situation, the disappearances, the lack of accountability, directly led to Kenya's democracy being downgraded by the CV-US Global Monitor. That's a clear international signal.
Okay, so alongside these chilling abductions, the pressure wasn't just sort of clandestine. It was also happening out in the open, wasn't it? Crackdowns on opposition figures, activists on the streets.
That's right. It's a broader picture of suppression. In late December 2024, for example, police moved pretty aggressively against demonstrators who were protesting the disappearances themselves. Deutsche Welle reported that Senator Okiya Omtata, he's a well-known opposition lawmaker, was arrested during a sit-in in Nairobi. They were demanding the release of the missing people.
And there was video of that, right? Tear gas.
Yes, video showed riot police using tear gas on these unarmed protesters just sitting there. When Senator Omtata and others linked arms, officers just dragged them away.
And these protesters, as DW noted, were specifically angry about these illegal detentions targeting critics. It was a direct response to those KNCHR numbers, 82 vanished since June, 7 in December alone.
Absolutely. And the activists there were vowing, not to leave the streets until everyone was released. It showed a real depth of feeling of frustration.
And it wasn't just street protests being targeted. You mentioned legislators, too.
Yes. Retorts suggest opposition lawmakers have faced intimidation, maybe investigations, youth-led vigils, campaigns linked to some opposition MPs. These have apparently been disrupted by police, often without any clear legal reason given.
Right.
There was one quite high-profile case involving an activist who worked with an MP on a protest petition. She got arrested on cybercrime charges just for publishing this parliamentary petition online.
Cybercrime for publishing a petition.
Exactly. She was jailed for weeks. It caused a huge outcry, and she was eventually pardoned. But it sent a clear message, didn't it? Using the law itself to silence critics.
And it seems like protest leaders, even people active on social media, were specifically targeted.
HRW documented that particularly after those June 2024 protests, police reportedly started, quote, tracking and abducting social media activists believed to be protest leaders. They used CCTV footage to identify people. A lot of young organizers, student activists, ended up being charged with things like illegal assembly. Amnesty Kenya sees this as a tactic, essentially, to criminalize dissent itself.
So, illegal detentions, street crackdowns. And then we get to perhaps the most explosive claims coming from inside the government's own former ranks. What happens when a former deputy president accuses the president of ordering a hit on him?
Well, it signals an extraordinary level of political breakdown, doesn't it? And a potentially very dangerous power struggle. Rigathi Gachagua, who was Ruto's deputy president, now a major opposition voice, made these claims publicly in May 2025. He alleged President Ruto ordered a direct attempt on his life.
The details he gave were quite something. A 4-page statement, intelligence about a covert killer squad.
Yes, incredibly specific. He claimed 101 heavily armed, hooded officers from elite units, DCI, anti-terrorism police, the GSU paramilitary unit, were sent to his constituency to, in his words, deal with him once and for all.
And he alleged they planned to plant weapons, even use poison.
That's what he claimed. Planting weapons to frame him, deploying biological poison. He said he only escaped because sympathetic insiders warned his security team just in time.
And this wasn't an isolated claim, according to him. He mentioned other incidents.
Exactly. He didn't just talk about this one alleged plot. He listed a series of violent incidents targeting him and his supporters in the Mount Kenya region since late 2024. Things like hired gangs disrupting opposition rallies, even funerals. And he explicitly accused the police of letting it happen. Not a single case has been prosecuted, he told the press.
And he accused the Interior Ministry of enabling this.
Yes, enabling impunity. He also complained, quite pointedly, that the government had ordered his personal security detail to be disarmed, leaving him feeling deliberately vulnerable.
Now, we have to stress, these are allegations from a major political rival. Gachagua is now firmly in opposition.
Absolutely crucial context. However, these claims weren't just dismissed out of hand. They got huge attention in Kenyan media, Capital FM, Citizen TV. They all reported the assassination plot allegations extensively.
And the government's response?
Officials have largely dismissed the claims as, sensational or baseless. The presidency itself, as far as we know, hasn't commented specifically on the alleged plot itself.
Okay, so beyond physical threats, alleged plots, there's another layer here. The pressure on independent media and civil society, that's always a key sign of democratic health, isn't it?
A critical barometer, yes. When journalists and NGOs can't operate freely, it really chills the entire public sphere. And we saw an example in May 2025 involving 4 Kenyan filmmakers, Nicholas Kichuki, Brian Edagala, Mark Krubiu, and Christopher Wame.
What happened to them?
They were briefly detained and actually charged after they worked on a BBC Africa Eye documentary. It was called Blood Parliament, and it investigated the violence by security forces during those June 2024 protests.
So they got arrested after the film came out?
Almost immediately after. NTV reported that the DCI got a search warrant based on allegations of false publication related to the BBC's online content and arrested the filmmakers.
The government denied the arrests were linked to the film, I assume?
Officially, yes, but press freedom groups widely saw it as direct retaliation for doing critical investigative journalism. Amnesty International's Kenya office called the arrests shocking on Press Freedom Day, a violation of free expression. They demanded the charges be dropped.
And argued the focus should be on the police actions documented in the film, not the filmmakers.
Precisely. Their point was resources should go into investigating the alleged killings of protesters, not punishing those who reported on it. It highlights a real clash of priorities.
And this wasn't the only incident suggesting media intimidation?
No, there have been other reports. Journalists, satirists, critical of the government facing harassment. Remember the cartoonist Gideon Kibet's disappearance and the courts being used too? That social media influencer arrested under cybercrime laws just for reposting a petition about taxes that case really worried digital rights groups.
Right.
It seems even minor criticisms in Parliament have drawn warnings. So taken together, you see a pattern emerging where exercising free speech or dissent leads to legal trouble. It suggests a deliberate effort to, well, stifle critical voices.
So with all of this unfolding, the abductions, the crackdowns, these explosive allegations, the media pressure, what's been the reaction, both inside Kenya and internationally? Is the government feeling any heat?
Well, internally, Kenyan civil society has been quite vocal. The KNCHR, as we mentioned, warned about the surge of abductions, demanding investigations. Other groups like the Civic Freedoms Forum, Lawyers for Human Rights, they've all called for accountability, for the rule of law to be upheld. And Human Rights Watch, in that November 2024 report, was very direct. They documented security forces abducting, arresting, torturing, and even killing perceived protest leaders.
And they urged action.
Strongly. Halt the disappearances, prosecute the officers involved. HRW's East Africa director warned quite starkly that this crackdown further taints Kenya's already dismal human rights record.
And what about outside Kenya? International reactions?
There has been pressure. Western governments, human rights bodies, they've started pushing Nairobi for answers. In January 2025, the British High Commissioner publicly called for swift and transparent investigations into the abductions. It was framed as needing to show Kenya's commitment to rights, especially important given Kenya's seat on the UN Human Rights Council.
So leveraging that international position.
Exactly. And UN experts, EU diplomats, they've made similar calls: protect civic space, uphold democratic norms.
And the fear is if nothing changes.
The fear among rights groups is that without real accountability, Kenya could slide towards, well, a climate of state terror. Amnesty Kenya put it powerfully: blaming critics for the country's problems just widens public distrust and erodes democracy. And that concern is reflected, as we noted, in Kenya's civic space monitor status being downgraded to repressed in early 2025. That's a consensus view among global watchers that things are moving in the wrong direction, and fast.
And how does the Ruto government frame all this? What's their public stance?
Their consistent line is that security agencies are acting legitimately, targeting criminal elements, and that they uphold due process and the rule of law. President Ruto himself, as we said, recently directed the police to investigate all the disappearance cases.
But there's skepticism about whether that will lead anywhere.
Deep skepticism from opponents and rights advocates, yes. They point to past inaction, the fact he initially dismissed kidnapping talk as fake news. And critically, analysts highlight that court orders have seemingly been ignored, and suspects haven't really been brought to justice in relation to these incidents. So there's a big gap between the official promises and what people see happening or not happening on the ground.
It really feels like Kenya is at a critical juncture, doesn't it? These reports we've discussed, unlawful arrests, torture claims, even these alleged assassination plots targeting critics, they raise profound questions about the rule of law. We've heard how opposition figures, protesters, feel they've been targeted, detained without warrant, faced violence, and journalists, artists, anyone critical facing threats or arrest.
Yes, and when a major international organization like HRW concludes that the evidence suggests state security forces, police, intelligence are involved in state-enabled violence against civilians, that's incredibly serious. The warning from observers is consistent. If the government doesn't conduct thorough, credible investigations and hold people accountable, Kenya's democracy, which many have worked so hard to build, will be weakened further, maybe, fundamentally damaged.
Which brings us to a really important question, maybe for you, the listener, to think about. What actually happens when the very institutions that are supposed to protect citizens and uphold order are implicated in undermining democratic freedoms? What are the long-term consequences for a country, for its people, when that fundamental public trust just crumbles under such circumstances? Something definitely worth considering. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into what's happening in Kenya, a complex and, frankly, worrying situation.